This is James Walker. 30 hours before the United Nations deadline for Iraq to leave Kuwait, two top PLO officials are assassinated in Tunis. Question: is this the opening salvo in the expected surge of terrorism? And who's responsible for the murders? Israel, which denies involvement, or Saddam Hussein, who ABC News has learned had a major falling out with one of the murdered men, Abu Iyad, just last month. His assassin, who is under arrest, has reported ties to terrorist Abu Nidal. Abu Nidal led the massacre of the Vienna and Rome airports in 1985 and is living in Baghdad at the invitation of Saddam Hussein, along with several other terrorists, including Abu Labas, who was involved in the hijacking of the cruise ship Achille Lauro. Indeed, early this month, Saddam alluded to the use of terrorism in this crisis, saying, "The theater of our operations includes every struggler and fighter whose hand can reach to harm aggressors in the whole world." That means a war could affect not only military targets in the desert, but civilian targets in countries opposing Saddam Hussein.
This is unprecedented. We have not been in a war with an opponent that has a terrorist option, and potentially a terrorist option as a strategic instrument. This is new for us.
Intelligence experts say an attack, which would most likely take place in the Middle East or Europe because of its relatively easy access, might be carried out not only by terrorists working for Saddam, but also by independent freelancers sympathetic to his cause.
North America is more difficult because you have far more control over the North American continent. Europe also has a hodgepodge of European, Middle Eastern, Islamic, left-wing, right-wing groups, all who see this present conflict in different lights and who are willing to give up their lives.
As a result, security has been tightened for U.S. military personnel and their dependents at installations throughout Europe. In Washington, D.C., 29 Iraqi diplomats were expelled from the country, part of the State Department effort to keep Iraq from setting up a terrorist network in the U.S. In an attempt to identify terrorists, the FBI has interrogated leaders of Arab American communities, and it's tracking down 3,000 Iraqis in the U.S. whose visas have expired.
The U.S. government has evidence that terrorists supported by Iraq are planning to mount attacks in most regions of the world.
Security has been beefed up at the nation's airports, at nuclear power plants, and other utilities. Like in many large cities, police in New York have joined with federal authorities in setting up a command center to share intelligence. And President Bush has put Saddam on notice.
We will hold Saddam Hussein directly responsible for any terrorist action.
What worries officials here is that Saddam Hussein has a history of using weapons of terror to achieve his ends, even against his own people. With military analysts saying Iraq is no match for the U.S. on the battlefield, terror tactics may be the only trump card Saddam holds, hoping that by employing them, he can break America's resolve. This is James Walker for Nightline.
And we are back live again from Amman, Jordan, and I am joined by two colleagues now. Pierre Salinger, ABC's chief foreign correspondent, reporting now from London. And here with me in Amman is Judith Kipper, a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution and also a consultant to ABC News. First to Pierre in London. Any hope, Pierre, in the minds of European leaders who have been very active until the last minute that it is still possible to avert Armageddon here?
No, Ted, I think that they have come to the conclusion that all these peace efforts have now collapsed. Even the French, who made a major effort in the last week, have now arrived at the point where their prime minister last night said there is no other solution but to go to war. So the peace initiative seems to have disappeared and is no longer seen as a possible way of solving the crisis.
Judith Kipper, what about one heard continually throughout these past few weeks about the need to give Saddam Hussein the opportunity to save face, and yet one does not get the impression that Saddam Hussein is in the least bit interested in saving face, that there are other things in his mind. Can you give us any kind of insight there?
Well, it's a real catch-22 situation because the face saving might show that in fact there was some willingness to deal on the part of Saddam Hussein. It's ironic that these peace proposals of the last few days have come after 5.5 months and not somewhere along the way, at least to test whether Saddam Hussein would indeed respond. This is a man with nerves of steel. He won't back down, And all he needs to do is stay alive during a war. It's a terrible tragedy coming in this area.
You and I were talking to a consultant, an Arab consultant here in Amman the other day, who was talking about Saddam's perspective on the number of lives that he can afford to lose versus the number of lives that Americans are prepared to lose.
Yes, I think that the Iraqi capacity to withstand losses, because it is a dictatorship, a ruthless totalitarian regime, is much greater than ours. I think it's a very, very difficult balance here between the Iraqis and the Americans, and the whole idea of a coalition, at least in this part of the world, has diminished greatly. It's an Iraqi-American confrontation from the point of view of people here.
Pierre Salinger, pick up a little bit on the theme that James Walker was discussing a few moments ago, the theme of terrorism. You have some incredible sources in that regard. What are the Europeans, for example, saying about the likelihood of an expansion in terrorism, both in Europe and in the United States?
Well, Ted, it's certain that security has gone up very, very high in Europe. Here in Great Britain, we are seeing British troops now surrounding, for example, Heathrow Airport. We have information from our sources that indicates that certain terrorist groups have deployed forces in a certain number of European countries, principally France, Germany, and Great Britain, that they are on alert for the start of the war, and that they are not looking at simple targets like people in the streets or even political leaders, but for a major terrorist attack that could create a worldwide, that would give people the impression that they were successful.
We've always had the feeling, Pierre, that it is more difficult for terrorists to operate in the United States than it is in Europe. What should Americans be looking for?
Well, Americans should be looking. It's interesting. I looked again yesterday at the minutes of the meeting between Saddam Hussein and April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, on the 25th of July before the invasion of Kuwait. And there is a line which indicates that if a war broke out, we cannot reach America militarily, he says, but there are other ways to reach America, which means that even at that point he was thinking in terms of the possibility of launching some kind of a terrorist attack in the United States, even though that is very complicated, and for the Middle East terrorists has not been successful up to now.
Pierre, thank you. Judith, thank you. We'll be back possibly with both of you a little bit later in the broadcast, but when we return, we'll be taking a look at the mood today on this eve before the deadline expires.